Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Porras, and thank you for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, the chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert of criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Dershowitz, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you. Happy Pesach.
Thank you so much. Happy Pesach over to you, too. Before we get started, the top news is the statements recently made by White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, who said even the Nazi regime under Hitler never used chemical weapons, as opposed to the Assad regime's attack last week. Professor Dershowitz, what are your thoughts on his comments?
Well, I think they were historically ignorant comments, and they shouldn't have been made. Nobody should make comparisons between anything and what Hitler did. One should never try to seek political advantage from Holocaust analogies. But the important point is that Sean Spicer has given a full-throated apology from his heart, and I take him seriously, and I think he really regrets having made that statement. But the same can't be said about the Democratic National Committee. The Democratic National Committee immediately tried to politicize this. They talked about how the Democrats can't tolerate even a whiff of anti-Semitism. There was nothing anti-Semitic about these comments. They were just foolish comments. The Democrats, on the other hand, particularly the Democratic National Committee, has as its co-chair a man who had more than a whiff of anti-Semitism in his past, a man who worked closely with the Reverend Louis Farrakhan, and said that he didn't recognize that Farrakhan was an anti-Semite. Everybody in the world recognized that Farrakhan was an anti-Semite. So the Democrats are politicizing this issue, and they shouldn't be doing that. And then there's this kind of phony organization named after Anne Frank, headed by a man who nobody's ever heard of, who has been demanding Spicer's resignation because this is the worst thing. It's Holocaust denial. It's total nonsense. Here's a guy who's just trying to get publicity, trying to bring his name forward on the back of Holocaust victims. So I think we have to make an agreement generally that nobody should be exploiting the Holocaust. Nobody should be taking political advantage of the Holocaust. Spicer has apologized. Now it's time for the Democrats to apologize, and for the Anne Frank Center, or whatever they call themselves, to apologize as well. And let's have an agreement that nobody will ever try to exploit the Holocaust for personal, financial, or any kind of political gain.
So you completely reject, like House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi's call for him to resign. You reject that. You think that's a little too far.
Nancy Pelosi has made a lot of stupid statements in her career. People are entitled to make mistakes. This is trying, again, to exploit the holiday of Pesach, to exploit the Jewish experience in the Holocaust to gain political advantage. No, I think it's wrong for the Democrats to use this as a political wedge. Look, I'm a liberal Democrat. I support the Democrats, but I'm very critical of the way the Democrats have used this mistake by Sean Spicer as a way of trying to gain political advantage. So no, I reject completely and categorically the statements of any Democrats or Republicans who are trying to gain political benefit from this mistake that Sean Spicer made and has now apologized for and regrets having made.
All right, thank you. All right, now turning now to the main topic of today's program, Middle East peace. You are known as one of the greatest proponents of the two-state solution, but it's quite obvious that this widely accepted term means many different things to different people. So we thought we would dedicate some time on this program to really hashing this out. So to help us do that, let me introduce our first guest, Galia Golan-Gild. Professor Golan is based at the Lauder School of Government at the Interdisciplinary Center of Herzliya. She specializes in international conflict resolution, current political issues, and of course the Arab-Israeli conflict. We caught up with Professor Golan at a recent conference at Tel Aviv University in memory of Ron Pundak, known as the architect of the Oslo Peace Agreements. Let's hear what is on her mind and what she wants to ask about the future of negotiated settlements.
I found that in my own research that there were, over the years, many opportunities, and I was not the only one to find this. There were a number of opportunities to make a peace, originally with Jordan, Egypt well before the '73 war, and with the Palestinians. One of the major obstacles has been something that Danny Bartal talked about, and that is the attitude amongst Israelis, not only the negotiators but the public, that all of this territory is ours. The other thing is this conception or this idea that the Arabs will never really accept us here. This is why Bibi wants not only recognition, because we got recognition from the Palestinians, not only recognition of our right to be here, which we also got from the Palestinians, but he wants the recognition of our right to be here as Jews, meaning that this is ours, which I'm not sure he's going to get. So my question really is, and I think this came from the discussions here today, is there a basis for making a deal? I believe that there has been a basis and that we could have had a deal a long time ago. But I look to people, lawyers, international lawyers, people who've dealt with this in the past and people who now want to take it on. How do they perceive a deal that will bring about the kind of two-state solution, which is the only real solution possible at this point in time? How to bring that about, bearing in mind the prejudices that we have on the Israeli side, the fears that we have on the Israeli side, but also the very basic necessity or the basic requirements of an agreement which will mean Israel pulling out from the occupied territories and allowing a genuinely sovereign Palestinian state next to the state of Israel.
Well, it's a great question, and it goes to the heart, obviously, of whether or not there can be a two-state solution. I believe there can and must be a two-state solution, though I don't think we'll ever have agreement as to the basis for the two-state solution. We'll never have agreement as to who was at fault and why we don't have a two-state solution. My own view, though I favor strongly a two-state solution, it has been almost exclusively the fault, not of necessarily the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian leadership, particularly the religious leadership. When Haj al-Husseini in 1937, 1938, in his testimony in front of the Peel Commission, basically turned the issue into a religious issue, not a territorial issue, not a political issue, where he rejected the notion of a Palestinian state, saying, we don't want a Palestinian state, we just don't want there to be a Jewish state. The Palestinians had an opportunity to have a state. After the Peel Commission, they rejected it. They had an opportunity to have a state after the United Nations partition. In 1947, they rejected it. There was an opportunity in 1967, Land for Peace. They went to Khartoum and rejected it. There was an opportunity in 2000, 2001 with the Ehud Barak and Clinton. They rejected it. There was an opportunity in 2008 with Ehud Olmert. They rejected it. So I think the fault is largely on the side of the Palestinian leadership, and that doesn't mean that that everybody has to agree with that. You can have disagreements as to the cause, disagreements as to the current situation, but agreement as to a two-state solution. I would also make a sharp distinction between ending the occupation and ending the settlements. Let's be very clear. Military occupation is completely lawful as long as there is any military resistance. And that was clearly shown by the mistaken decision, a decision which I supported, but in retrospect was a mistake, of Prime Minister Sharon to end the military occupation of the Gaza. What he should have done is ended the settlements in the Gaza. Those are not proper. They should have ended. They did end. But he should have kept a military presence to prevent Hamas, a terrorist organization, from taking over and using the land as a launching pad for rockets and a launching pad for terror tunnels. And I think many Israelis have learned the lesson on the West Bank as well. There should be a two-state solution. There should be an end of new settlements. There should be an agreement as to changes, swaps of land with the current settlement places, with areas that could become part of a Palestinian state. But Israel will probably have to maintain some military presence on the West Bank to prevent not only ISIS and to protect against any kind of an attack from either Syria or Jordan, but also to prevent Hamas and other terrorist groups from taking over in the West Bank. So I make a sharp distinction between the end of the settlements and the end of the military occupation. The military occupation can be reduced. Look, there is no military occupation of Ramallah. You go to Ramallah, you don't see a single Israeli soldier or policeman. There is essentially self-rule in Ramallah. So I do think that a two-state solution is viable, possible. I don't think the settlements are a major barrier to that. You can work around the settlements. You can make compromises. And I think we don't have to resolve the issue about whether Judea and Samaria or the West Bank belongs to Israel or belongs to the Palestinians. Let each side believe what they want to believe. The important thing is progress on the ground. So if the Israelis want to think that all of the West Bank belongs to Israel and they're making a compromise, that's fine. If some want to believe that it doesn't belong to Israel and they're just giving back to the Palestinians what the Palestinians are entitled to, let them believe that. Interestingly enough, Judaism is not a religion with a catechism. You don't have to have universality of belief. The Rambam's concept of ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema has been rejected by Judaism in practice. There are no 13 principles that all Jews agree to, and there's no consensus on what is a Jew, what is the Jewish state. Let the debate continue. The Talmud raged with debate until the close of the Talmudic period. Let the debate continue as long as there is a political, practical resolution on the ground, and I think that's completely viable. It will take an enormous amount of effort. Look, it took so many years for Israel to be established as a state. There was so much dispute among Zionists as to whether Israel should be a homeland or a state, and that took years to resolve. Finally, Ben-Gurion's views prevailed, compromise views prevailed, and I think it will take years, perhaps, before a completely viable solution to the West Bank will be established, but I think it's the only viable solution. And so I'm continuing to support the two-state solution while insisting that we don't have to have a conceptual or theoretical agreement about the basis on which it should come into existence.
Thank you, Professor. So now I'd like to introduce, I'm happy to say, Yishai Fleischer, the international spokesperson for the Jewish community of Hebron. Yishai is also an Israeli broadcaster and a frequent columnist for major news websites. His recent op-ed in the New York Times challenged the entire premise of a two-state solution and caused quite a storm. Yishai holds a J.D. from Cardozo Law and a rabbinic ordination from Kolel Agudat Achim. He is a paratrooper in the IDF Reserves and lives with his family on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Thank you so much, Yishai, for coming in. Now, I know that you have a very different approach, so why don't you pick up where Alan left off and feel free to relate to anything else that you may have just heard as well.
First thing, it's an honor to be on the show, and Professor Dershowitz, you look great with that matzah tie. Happy Pesach. And it's an honor to be with you. You're one of the great defenders of the Jewish people and of Israel in this generation. So more power to you, and I'm amazed that you keep fighting it even on this show. With regarding to the two-state solution, though, it looks like that it's a proven failure. Land for Peace has simply failed at every turn. Every place that we've walked out of has become a forward base for the jihad. Even Sinai has succumbed now to the ISIS of the Sinai province, South Lebanon. Certainly the Gaza experiment proved to every pragmatic Israeli, and we see that now through the voting patterns of Israelis, is that nobody believes that Land for Peace works anymore. I mean, very few people believe. You walk away from this land, and what do you get instead? You get a forward base of the jihad that's going to rain rockets upon you. It's those things that you outlined, Professor Dershowitz, were beautiful concepts, but they have no basis in reality. The reality is that Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is the strategic high ground of this area. On top of that, we have a jihadist milieu in this region, and therefore, if you give any of that land away, it's going to endanger the rest of the Jewish state. Furthermore, it's our ancestral homeland. This is the key to our narrative. If we don't have rights in Hebron or in Eastern Jerusalem, we don't have rights in Tel Aviv. And outside of AIPAC, where you spoke, there's a lot of Jewish kids protesting about the occupation. And they're saying, you've stolen land. And inside, Professor Dershowitz comes on and says, but Israel's got great water technology. Well, that's all fantastic and lovely. We've got to make an answer, give an answer to the accusation of occupation. There's only one answer to that accusation, which is it's our land. In 55 land conflicts in this region, there's only one party that believes that we'll have peace by giving away more land. It is so un-Middle Eastern. It is so Western. It's almost, when they tell us that we're occupiers and colonialists, when we say to them, well, we want a two-state solution, we're actually proving to them that we are Western and not Middle Eastern. We have to hold on to our land, our ancestral homeland, our strategic highland, push back the jihad, and the Arabs that will live in our country will live a great life. We will give them a great life. We will give them rights and opportunities, but we won't give them the control of our tiny land.
Well, again, that gives rise to the answer, which is a cliche, but really has some truth, and that is, Israel has to choose between being a Jewish state and a democratic state. Now, Carol Glick says it can be both. Just take over the West Bank and don't worry about the demography. There aren't going to be enough Arabs to outvote the Jews. That's a hope and a possibility, but unlikely in my view. There are two narratives, obviously. The Jewish narrative, which begins in Hebron, obviously, and continues up through many of the areas of the West Bank, the Jewish narrative. And then there's the Arab narrative, which has become a Palestinian narrative only in the last 50 or 60 years. The world has not accepted and recognized solely the Jewish narrative. It's recognized the need for some kind of a compromise. And life is based on compromises. Look, do the Jews have a right to maintain Hebron? Of course they do. Giving up Hebron for the Jews would be like giving up Salt Lake City for the Mormons, the Vatican for the Catholics, and Mecca and Medina for the Protestants. I'm sorry, for the Muslims. That doesn't mean that compromises aren't in order. The reality on the ground is that the Palestinians, as a result largely of what Israel failed to do, I think, in '67, I was a big supporter of the Alon Plan. I helped to draft in a very small way Resolution 242 of the Security Council that basically was a land for peace resolution. I think Israel should have simply annexed areas that it captured that were necessary for its security and given the rest back to Jordan. That is ancient history. It's not going to happen anymore. And now there are only messy solutions. There's no perfect solution. I acknowledge that. There's no perfect solution at all. What we're looking for is the least worst solution, a solution that would be acceptable to a majority of Israelis, a majority of Palestinians, a solution that would enable Israel to continue to thrive, yes, and create water out of air, and do tremendous medical advances, turn our swords into plowshares. The peace dividend would be remarkable. If we made peace with the Palestinians, I think peace with the Emirates would be forthcoming fairly quickly. We would have better relations with other Arab and Muslim countries in the Middle East and around the world. We would have better relations with Europe, better relations with the United States. But without a perfect solution. Every solution is going to carry with it risks. I think that maintaining the status quo is very risky as well. And so I'm in favor of maintaining the settlement blocks the way they are, keeping the security border the way it is, which has been very protective of Israeli civilian lives, maintaining a military presence on the West Bank for the indefinite future, maintaining an Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley and near the borders, not surrendering the Golan, which is strategic, but allowing for there to be a demilitarized state. Benjamin Netanyahu calls it a state minus, and I think that's right, but they would have the right to participate fully in their own elections and be recognized as a sovereign state, but a sovereign state without the ability to have an army, and which is under Israeli military control to some degree. Certainly not a perfect solution, but it's a solution that Israelis favor, and Israel is a democracy, and in the end, the views of the Israelis have to be the determining factor. It's a view that most supporters of Israel around the world favor, and again, imperfect. And again, as I said before, the Palestinians don't deserve a state any more than the Kurds or the Tibetans or the Chechens. They are not highest on the list of deserving people for a state. In fact, they're relatively low on the list because they're Johnny-come-latelys in some respects, and second, they've used terrorism and violence, and others have not. It's my belief that the Israeli people deserve for there to be a Palestinian state under the conditions that I've set forth. So let's continue to have this debate. I do think that perhaps in my lifetime, certainly in your lifetime, and by the way, I want to commend you. I thought your op-ed piece in the Times was brilliant, very well laid out, very well thought through. As you know, I don't agree with it, but Let the debate continue. Let your position be heard. Let you try to persuade the Israeli people. Let me try to persuade people who will listen to me. And in the end, I hope we will have a compromised two-state solution which will assure the security of the Israeli people, maximize their security, and allow there to be finally shalom, shalom, instead of shalom, shalom, ve'en shalom. So I'm an optimist. As you know, in Israel, a pessimist is one who says things are so bad they can't get any worse. An optimist is one who says, yes, they can. I'm an optimist, not in that sense, but an optimist in the realistic sense. So I'm going to continue to work hard for a two-state solution. I encourage you to work hard for what you believe is the right solution. That's the nature of democracy.
One thing you said, Professor Dershowitz, about the world not accepting, I know I've been following your career for many years, and I know one thing is that you've never been a person who has succumbed to the popular agenda and the popular paradigm. You've always fought back against what the world says. Israel's got a right to exist, and it certainly has a right to exist in its ancestral homeland. The problem that I'm trying to kind of pull out of the things that you're saying is that it doesn't give our young people a solid narrative to work off of. You laid out a plan for a Palestinian state which says Israel's going to stay in the Jordan Valley. The settlements are going to stay, most of them anyway. There'll be a demilitarized Palestinian state. Nobody's really going to accept that. And it sounds very paternalistic. It sounds like we are holding on to a land that's really not ours. Because we should be creating somebody else's state there, but we're going to tell it how to run its affairs. It's never going to work. And the young people of this generation on college campuses in America are turning to the J Streets of this world. And it hurts me to think that you're in alignment with J Street, which I really think you're not. But in two-statism, you're on the same platform there. You're in the same idea. And they're looking at us and they're saying, you must be liars because you're promising a two-state solution, yet it hasn't happened in 40 years. I'm saying, let's open up the dialogue. You always talk about dialogue, opening up the conversation. When people say to me, the two-state solution is the only solution, it certainly is not the only solution. It's actually a recurring failure, and is not going to happen. Even Netanyahu has said, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, we can't do it given this current jihadist atmosphere. So let's offer up people options, alternatives that can work. And I'm saying, listen, let's hold on to our tiny land. Let's give people residency, a pathway to citizenship if they are not seditious. Let's say that this is our ancestral homeland. We're going to hold on to it. We're going to push back on the bullies, and we're going to be strong in this land. By the way, 1 in 10 Israelis now lives in the West Bank, and the government is 67 seats to the right, meaning to say more and more Israelis are starting to think that Land for Peace doesn't work, and they're moving into Judea and Samaria. The settlements, quote unquote, or nascent Jewish communities in our ancestral homeland are only going to grow.
In a democracy, let's remember that even the right wing, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has said that he supports the kind of two-state solution that I've outlined. Obviously, his predecessors on the right also supported some kind of a two-state solution. So, in a democracy, we have to continue the debate. And in the end, the Israeli people will decide. There is a law now that requires a referendum before Israel surrenders large amounts of land on the West Bank. And so the people will decide. I think it's important for you to continue your advocacy, for me to continue my advocacy, for the political leaders to continue setting out positions of compromise. But in the end, it's not the narrative that will prevail. It's the pragmatism on the ground. We will never agree on a narrative, never, ever agree on a narrative. Remember, too, that Israel is largely a secular nation state of the Jewish people. The vast majority of Israelis are secular. They do believe that the Bible lays out a heritage. And, of course, we all remember the first Rashi for the word Bereshit, which explains that one of the reasons that the book of Genesis begins with the story of creation is to give the Jews the right to claim all of Israel. But of course, if you take that literally, that you would extend Israel from the Tigris to the Euphrates to the Mediterranean, it would become a land different from the land of Israel as we know it. So the Bible is not going to solve this problem. Let me tell you that law is not going to solve this problem. It will not be a matter of law. It will be a matter of uncomfortable compromise in the end, where neither side will get exactly what they want, where neither side's narrative will be validated. But in the end, if we can bring about an imperfect peace, I'd rather see that than a perfect belligerency or perfect war.
All right, well, thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your time. I'd also like to thank our guests, Professor Golan and, of course, Yishai Fleischer, for joining us today. If you would like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.